morning. Today we're going to consider a final reflection, number 11, on the topic that we've been discussing, liturgy as model of prayer and icon of life. The topic of this final reflection is fidelity to the icon of our liturgy. It is an axiom of anthropology that human beings are distinguished by common behavior shaped through shared meanings. And human societies are distinguished from one another by meanings shared by one group, but not by another. One such shared meaning has always been religious belief, and one such common behavior has been to express this belief in ritual. So liturgy is a church's chief way of saying what it is. The Latin adage attributed to Prosper of Aquitaine, who died around 463, ut legem credendi lex statuat supplicandi, that is to say, let the rule of prayer set the rule of belief, summarizes the relationship between a community's worship and its beliefs. As you pray, so do you believe. Gerhard Delling puts this in sociological terms when he says, worship is the self-portrayal of religion. In worship, the sources by which religion lives are made visible. Its expectations and hopes are expressed, and the forces which sustain it are made known. In many respects, the essence of a religion is more directly intelligible in its worship than in statements of its basic principles, or even in descriptions of its sentiments." End quote. So even when the basic religious belief is the same as among Eastern and Western Catholic Christians, that common faith receives specific coloration from the particular lived experience of that faith within distinct historical cultural settings. To put it another way, to express a distinct identity, one must have a distinct identity, and therein lies our problem that I would like to discuss today. For our distinct liturgy is the most perfect and official expression of our identity, of the soul that animates our tradition. It is by no means, however, the only component of a particular tradition, for a cultural expression is meaningless unless prior to it there is something cultural to express. And so our Catholic Church's Eastern rites include all of the other elements one would expect to find in a Catholic culture. Schools of theology with their fathers and doctors, canonical discipline, spirituality, devotions, monasticism, art, architecture, hymns, music, and this must be stressed, the particular spirit that created this tradition, that in turn is fed by this tradition, and that is essential to the identity of this tradition. In his 1944 encyclical Orientalis Ecclesiae, Pius XII indicated clearly that our Eastern Catholic traditions include much more than liturgy. He says it is important to hold in due esteem all that constitutes for Oriental peoples their own special patrimony, as it were, handed down to them by their forefathers, and this whether it regards the sacred liturgy and the hierarchical orders or the other essentials of Christian life. So an Eastern rite is not just a different way of saying Mass. It is a special patrimony. It has feasts and fasts, but not the same feasts and fasts as others. It has saints and shrines, but not the same saints and shrines. It has veneration of the Mother of God, but not the same devotional practices expressing that veneration. It has a hierarchical structure and canon law, but not the same hierarchical structure or the same canon law. And what is most important, as Pius XII wrote, it is another genius and temperament, an Eastern ethos from which these ritual and devotional differences flow. We are so accustomed to certain manifestations of the distinct Western Catholic identity that the culturally limited nature of their specificity tends to escape us. Let me give a banal example familiar to all of us: the Marian appearances at Lourdes. Surely one would think such an epiphany of grace was a universal Catholic religious phenomenon exceeding the bounds of any cultural limitation. But was it? How did Mary appear? Alone. That is to say, not holding her divine Son in her arms. Perfectly Western, but inconceivable in the Byzantine Rite cultural context, in which Mary is Theotokos, Bogorodica, the God-bearer whose total merit is that she brings us her divine Son. To depict her without him is to take her outside the only salvation history context in which her true mission and purpose are clearly manifest. Mary, like everyone else, has no meaning theologically apart from her Son. How was Mary dressed? With a rosary hanging from her girdle, a purely Latin Marian devotion. What did St. Bernadette say Mary called herself? That she was the Immaculate Conception, an exclusively Western theological formulation of the doctrine of the sinlessness from the beginning of the Mother of God. And let us note in passing that she said it in her patois, not in Old Slavonic or Armenian. What devotional practices did she recommend? The Akaphist, the Paraclesis, the Jesus Prayer, the Canon of St. Andrew of Crete. I wish to stress that everything I have been talking about is an integral part of the heritage we know is our rite. To try to imagine the Byzantine Rite without St. Basil the Great's theology of the Holy Spirit and the definitions of the First Council of Constantinople in 381, without the victory over iconoclasm in 843, without Theodore Thucydides, is like trying to understand Italian without Dante, or English without Shakespeare, the King James Bible, and the Book of Common Prayer. As with language, so too with liturgy, individuals do not create them. Peoples and their cultures do. Individuals just learn them. As the great Anglican liturgist Dom Gregory Dix wrote, liturgy is the vital act of the Church's life. In the end, it will mold the ideas of those who live that life. In other words, we do not create our liturgy. Our liturgy creates us. The depth and breadth and elusiveness of the classical rites comes just from this, Dix continues, that their real author is always the worshiping Church, not any individual, however holy and gifted, any committee, however representative, or any legislator, however wise. The good liturgies were not written, they grew. End of quotation. So one can no more invent a living liturgy than one can invent a living language. One does not create one's mother tongue. One learns it as an essential part of one's cultural heritage that exists prior to and independent of our will or desires, whether we like it or not. So one's rite or liturgical tradition comprises the essential expression of a particular church's identity, and as such must be preserved in its integrity. Any liturgical tradition, like a language, comprises an integral whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. It is the totality, the complete synthesis that is the reality, in the face of which comparison with what is or is not done, what is or is not the custom in another tradition, has no more validity than it does in spoken and written languages. This does not mean that there can be no change or liturgical reform, but liturgical form deals not with liturgy, it deals with but a particular liturgy, which, like a particular language, has certain native shapes and structures that any change or development must respect if that reality is to retain its identity intact. At this point, one might wearily wish to ask, but do we really need all this? The answer is, of course, no. Not any more than we needed the Incarnation, since God could have saved us by snapping his fingers if he wanted to, and not any more than Italian had to have a definite article. But the question is misplaced, for what we are dealing with is not what could have been, but what is. English does have a definite and indefinite article. Ukrainian does not. The Byzantine rite has the Zion or boiling water poured into the chalice. Other rites do not. And to remain what we are, to preserve our identity, it must remain intact. We cannot play games with our heritage. Why should our identity remain intact? Because that is the nature of things. For the English language to be English, it must remain English. And for the Byzantine liturgy to be the Byzantine liturgy, it has to remain just that. Not all languages have articles, but English does. It has a definite and an indefinite article. And one cannot speak and write literate English without them. The fact that Latin and Russian do not have articles cannot be used to argue that English can do without them. And the same is true of liturgy. One cannot just introduce into a particular liturgy whatever one sees in another tradition that looks good, without taking into account the integral structure and genius of each rite. And vice versa, the fact that one rite does not have this or that ritual or devotion, or prayer or vestment, or piece of furniture, does not mean another rite can drop it any more than modern Bulgarian can drop its enclitic definite article just because Ukrainian doesn't have one. Of course, one cannot maintain the integrity of one's cultural heritage unless one knows and understands the nature of one's ecclesial tradition. And this is the real problem: ignorance, which of course is why the Holy See and the Oriental Congregation's 1996 Instruction on the Liturgy insist so much on proper liturgical formation. Ironically, however, the Eastern Catholic liturgical renewal, so strenuously fostered by the Holy See since Pope Leo XIII, has been opposed every step of the way by those who should have welcomed it on bended knee as a grace of God. I mean, of course, the Eastern Catholic hierarchy, with a few notable exceptions like Andrei Sheptitsky, Archbishop of Lviv, Metropolitan of Halich, and Primate of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Various reasons are given for this opposition, but as usual in such matters, the real roots go much deeper. The real issue is not ritual practice at all. Many of the rubrical niceties that divide the clergy, the size and shape of a veil or discourse, the cut and length of a vestment, the amplitude of one's riasa sleeves, where to put the endimension, are of little or no significance in themselves. But these have become symbols of religious identity, much as was true of the ritualist movement in late 19th century Anglicanism. At issue were not mere differences of rubric, but symbolic affirmations of the high church conviction that Anglicanism was not Protestant, but Catholic. At bottom, then, what we are faced with is two different interpretations of a community's past, two different historical visions. This is possible because history is not just a shared past, but one's view of that past seen through the lens of present concerns. This vision is not a passive view of the past as an objective reality, but a pattern formed through a process of selection determined by one's present outlook. Some Eastern Catholic clergy see their history as a progress from schism and spiritual stagnation to a life of discipline, renewal, and restored religious practice in the Catholic communion. For this group, the adoption of certain Latin, they would say Catholic devotions and liturgical uses, is a sign of this new identity. Such attitudes reflect an interior erosion of the Eastern Christian consciousness, a Latinization of the heart, resulting from a formation insensitive to the true nature of the variety of traditions within the Catholic Church. Others, like myself, while not at all denying their commitment to the Catholic communion, nor underestimating the obvious spiritual benefits it has brought their churches, see themselves as Orthodox in communion with Rome, distinguished from their Orthodox sister churches in nothing but the fact of that communion and its doctrinal and ecclesial consequences. Right. They see the Latinizations that have crept into their tradition as a loss of identity, an erosion of their heritage in favor of foreign customs with which they can in no wise identify themselves. For some, Latinization is a sign of their identity, for others its negation, and both are right because they perceive themselves differently. Underlying these issues, of course, is the more serious question, of Rome's credibility. Is the Holy See to be believed in what it says about restoring the Eastern Catholic heritage? The morale of some of the younger Eastern Catholic clergy has of late been deeply affected by this cul-de-sac, this dead-end street. They feel mandated to do one thing by the Holy See, and then are criticized or even disciplined by their bishop if they try to obey. The problem, as usual, is one of leadership, without which the hesitant or reluctant have no one to follow. What is needed is not just discipline and obedience, but also a clergy education loyal to the clear policy of the Church on this question, and prudent pastoral preparation. This is the only way out of the vicious circle that has been created. The proposed reforms are resisted because the clergy and people are not prepared to accept them, yet some church leaders do little or nothing to prepare the clergy and people for a renewal that the leaders themselves neither understand nor accept. I cannot pretend to read minds, but I think there are two main reasons behind this deep-rooted reluctance to welcome the clear and unambiguous policy of Rome in its program of liturgical restoration of the Eastern traditions. First, its opponents consider the restoration a pointless archaism. Secondly, they are convinced in their hearts that some of the practices proposed are not really Catholic, and hence not right. That this directly contradicts the explicit teaching of the Holy See is an irony that does not seem to dawn on them. The first objection is easily dispensed with. The orientation of Catholic liturgical renewal is never towards the past, but towards present pastoral needs. Of course, the liturgical scholar studies the past, but the purpose of such historical research is not to discover the past, much less to imitate it, but to recover the integrity of the pristine tradition that the past may well have obscured. The aim is not to restore the past, but to overcome it. For history is not the past, but a genetic vision of the present, a present seen in continuity with its roots. It is precisely those who do not know their past that are incapable of true organic change. They remain victims of the latest cliché, prisoners of present usage because they have no objective standard against which to measure it. The proposed restoration, then, is not a blind imitation of a dead past, but an attempt precisely to free Eastern Catholics from a past in which, severed from the roots of their own tradition, they were deprived of any organic development and could conceive of growth only as sterile civility to their Latin fellow Catholics. Can one seriously propose this as a program to be preserved in our day? Hence the irony of those critics of the Eastern Catholic liturgical restoration who accuse its promoters of fostering a return to the Middle Ages. It is precisely in the Middle Ages that age-old practices like infant communion in the Roman Rite are first called into question for typically medieval motives that no one with any sense would heed today. So it is not the proponents of restoration, but its opponents that are behind the times, stuck in a medieval rut out of which the major Catholic scholarly voices in this field have been leading the Church in the past century and in the present one. A short list of the issues where renewal of the Eastern Catholic heritage has met most resistance will include dropping the filioque from the creed, the consecratory epiclesis after the words of institution, the unmixed chalice of the Armenian tradition, the Byzantine Zeon Atyplata rite in which boiling water is added to the chalice just before communion, infant communion, and in the Syro-Malabar tradition, proleptic language, Eucharist facing east, and the restoration of the Bema and the so-called anaphoras of Nestorius and Theodore. On each of these points, the Holy See's effort at restoration have met with massive resistance, either active or passive, from some circles, and I know what I am talking about as one who has been a protagonist of these battles as consultor for liturgy of the Oriental Congregation in Rome for over 30 years. Permit me to give a few examples of what I mean by the integrity of a tradition and how it must be respected. I will take my example from a completely neutral area, the church year. It is well known that Latin Catholics have developed devotion to Mary during the month of May, considered the month of Mary par excellence. And so, inevitably, some Eastern Catholic churches have imitated this practice, as if they did not already have their own and far more liturgically suitable liturgical season of Mary, thereby manifesting their complete ignorance of the dynamics of the liturgical year as celebrated in their own traditions. Because of Mary's inseparable link with the mystery of the Incarnation, in the most ancient theological and liturgical traditions of the East, the cult of the Mother of God is an integral part of the Nativity Epiphany cycle. The roots of Advent in the oldest festive celebration and preparation for Christmas was a commemoration of the Annunciation, originally just before Christmas. And still today in the Syrian traditions, Subara, Annunciation, is the name for Advent. This forms the backdrop for the latest New Catholic liturgical dispositions regarding the liturgical cult of Mary in the Roman Rite. The January 1st feast of the Solemnity of Mary, the Mother of God, was reinstituted in the new general Roman calendar by the Reformed decree Anni Liturgici Ordinazione of March 21, 1969. This reform not only restored the ancient Roman Rite usage, but also brought Western liturgy into line with the most ancient theological and liturgical traditions of the East. The restoration of this most ancient of Marian mysteries, the divine maternity or motherhood, to the Western nativity cycle, can only be welcomed as a recovery of a traditional and organic liturgical sensibility common to East and West. These are not personal opinions I am expressing. That our liturgical traditions must be preserved in their integrity and restored when that integrity has been diminished or diluted or lost has been endlessly repeated in the authoritative magisterial teaching of the Catholic Church by all the popes over the past century and a half, by the new Roman editions of the Eastern Catholic liturgical books and the accompanying 1944 Ordo Celebrationis Vesperarum Matutini et Divinae Liturgiae, the order for the celebration of Vespers, Matins, and the Divine Liturgy, according to the Ruthenian Recension, by the Vatican II decrees Orientalium Ecclesiarum, Sacrosanctum Concilium, Lumen Gentium, Unitatis Rei Negratio, by the new Code of Canons of the Oriental Churches, by Pope John Paul II's discourses during the Marian year, by his encyclical Orientale Lumen, etc., and by the Oriental Congregation's 1996 instruction for the application of the liturgical norms of the Code of Canon Laws of the Oriental Churches. The 1964 Vatican II decree on the Eastern Catholic Churches reaffirms this unambiguously in numbers 6 and 12. I quote, "All members of the Eastern Churches should be firmly convinced that they can and ought always preserve their own legitimate liturgical rites and ways of life, and that changes are to be introduced only to forward their own organic development. They themselves are to carry out all these prescriptions with the greatest fidelity. They are to aim always at a more perfect knowledge and practice of their rites, and if they have fallen away due to circumstances of time or persons, they are to strive to return to their ancestral tradition. The Holy Ecumenical Council confirms and approves the ancient discipline concerning the sacraments which exist in the Eastern churches, and also the ritual observed in their celebration and administration, and wishes this to be restored where such a case arises." Let us be perfectly clear. The reason for the existence of Eastern Catholic churches as particular sui juris churches is their distinct ecclesial patrimony. That is to say, their right, in the full sense of that term, their entire ecclesial tradition. Our right is not just an essential part of our identity. It is our identity. If the only thing that distinguishes our right from that of our Orthodox sister churches is our communion with and obedience to the Holy See of Rome, then one can legitimately ask what kind of Eastern Catholic ecclesiology could ignore such clear and repeated instructions of the Holy See in this regard. The answer is, of course, perfectly obvious to anyone capable of thought. How then is it still possible to find Ukrainian Catholic churches and chapels without an iconostasis, when 64 years ago the 1944 Order for the Celebration of Vespers, Matins, and the Divine Liturgy, promulgated by the Oriental Congregation in Rome, decreed that altars are not considered truly apt for celebrating the liturgical office as long as they lack their own iconostasis? How is it that one still sees pre-cut particles commonly used in the prothesis rite of preparation of the gifts, when the same order decrees that all the ceremonies of the prothesis, or proscomedia, are performed over the prosper, or part of it, by cutting the bread and extracting the lamb and the particles as prescribed? Number 98. I am tempted to ask why, if an outsider like myself has dedicated his entire life to knowing, loving, and spreading knowledge and love of this wonderful tradition he has adopted, why those born into it cannot do the same. Am I wasting my time, or are you someday going to wake up and be what the Church of God not only wants you to be, but commands you to be? Priests in the Russian and some other Byzantine Slavonic traditions wear a pectoral cross inscribed on the back with an inscription that begins, Obraz Budi, you be the image. That is my wish and prayer for you today, that you in your ministry be the icon for others of what the Church wants you to be by knowing, loving, and living your authentic tradition as the Church wishes it to be. Thank you for your attention.